Welcome everybody, a warm welcome to those attending and to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. My name is Councillor John Riley and I am the chairman of this meeting, which is the Finance and Corporate Services Select Committee. Details of the business to be considered today are shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and online under the live broadcast. We're not expecting any fire drills, so if the alarm does go off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. Please make sure that any mobiles or tablets or other devices are on silent unless you're using them to access the information about this meeting. Before we move on to the agenda, I'd like to introduce the councillors and officers present. So I will start with Councillor Lewis on this side, which if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Councillor Richard Lewis. Councillor Kishan Bhatt.
Councillor Peter Smallwood.
Councillor Gasharan Mand.
Councillor Narinder Garg.
Councillor Stuart Mathers.
Anisha Teji, Democratic Services.
Thank you very much. So, on to the agenda for tonight's meeting. And first of all, apologies for absence.
Apologies from Councillor Banerjee with Councillor Smallwood substituting.
And Councillor Smallwood, you're very welcome to this meeting. Good to see you. Declarations of interest in matters coming before this meeting, other than the usual? No? All right, thank you. To confirm, the items of business marked in Part 1 will be considered in public, and items marked as private will be in private in Part 2, but I don't think we've got any Part 2 matters. Right, minutes of the previous meeting, which was held on the 20th of October. And this was a very good meeting, I thought. We learnt a very great deal from the excellent guests that we had. And this was part of the themed sessions in relation to procurement. So does anybody have any particular questions in relation to the minutes of the meeting, or can we say they are agreed? All right, thank you very much. So, to go on to the main business of the evening, which is a continuation of the review of procurement within Hillingdon, and this is the second witness session. Our witness is a little late, so what we can do is to start to go through some of what is set out in agenda item 5, which you will all have seen and read. What we are guided by there is the various stages of procurement as they stand at present. And certainly one of the things I was thinking that we could raise with Matthew is the extent to which, in a sort of blue skies way of thinking, what he would like to do to make the system more efficient, less time consuming, and less repetitious for him and his officers, because it's pretty obvious that an awful lot of procurement is very, very repetitious in terms of what they need to do. And trying to free up time for them, for officers, in terms of doing much more expansive and what is termed dynamic procurement, is a very considerable aim as far as they're concerned. So trying to think around ideas which make that what they actually do a lot easier and a lot more efficient, I think would be a useful exercise. And also to see what other models there are than the one we adopt. So I'm not saying necessarily we should change, but it would be useful to see if there are other models that make more business sense and more rational sense for officers. We heard last time about the procurement bill, which at some stage presumably will come into law, and there's an enormous amount of new material in that. But equally, a lot of people in various industries are saying that there's not been enough innovation in that, as we discussed last time. So again, it would be interesting to get Matthew's take on that. Another area that I was very interested in, having been directed towards it by others who involved in this area, are the idea of framework agreements. So when you look at some of the examples that we were given in here, so for example, we will know in advance that we need certain things in rolling progress. So for housing stock, you may want to replace bathrooms, kitchens and various aspects of domestic living. So if we know that there's a life cycle for those things, there can't be an individual procurement method for those sorts of things. And I was just wondering the other day whether or not we can, there's any capacity to bring those sorts of things together. So to look across the council's procurement needs and see what areas can be brought into single processes so that you don't have to do the same thing over and over again. A framework agreement is where, as I understand it, you set a timescale and then have a sequence of companies, maybe somewhere between, you set a figure maybe between 4 and 9 or something, and they stay with you for a number of years, and then you redo it again after 3 or 5 years, whatever you pitch. So I think that there's lots of scope, I think, for finding out from Matthew what sort of things he's able to look at, and the extent to which they're able to look at. A lot of this material that we've got is examples of what they do. Councillor Lewis.
I was just going to say, Chairman, we've moved away from the scheduled maintenance programmes because actually we found that we were taking out decent kitchens before they were out of life, and boilers before they were out of service, and it all depends on how they're used and abused, and so we've moved away from that idea. But there is obviously more that we can look at, and we could probably even look at service plans when we buy things from suppliers. So I'll just pass it on for what it's worth.
It's a very good point. My thinking was that not so much having a lifespan, as it were, that we cut off and say after so many years we must replace, because people don't do that in their own domestic circumstances. You tend to keep things until they start getting a bit tatty or until they don't work anymore. Rarely do people, I suspect, say, well, after 3 years I'm going to get a new kitchen every 3 years or whatever. But similarly, there will be ranges of things that that can be brought within a single time frame, or at least similar things that will be brought into a single time frame, rather than looking at lots of different areas. Maybe there's a scope for that, but the idea of frameworks where you have a number of companies that register with you, and then you have that number to choose from, and then you refresh that after a certain length of time, I think is maybe something worth looking at least anyway. The other thing is, how do we meet this challenge about helping local businesses, which is something I'd quite like to look at. But I do understand that we've tried very hard over a long period of time to engage with small business, and it's quite difficult for lots of different reasons, not least of which is the complexity of large-scale procurement. You want to come in again? Councillor Batt.
Thank you, Chair. I think that one of the key things is how we actively seek out sort of these local businesses, and to what extent, as a council, what will they do to engage with sort of local chambers of commerce? Because as a council in Northwood Hills, we're about to set up a local chambers of commerce, and there's loads of networking groups out there. One which I'm part of, which is BNI. And I don't know to what extent they're kind of looking into these kind of groups to kind of find these local businesses, and whether or not, I guess one of the good things we could do is, as part of our remit here in the Select Committee, is perhaps even invite one of the leaders of the Chambers of Commerce in Hillingdon to come as a witness and kind of question them about how useful to what extent the local businesses are actually putting bids forward, and whether or not we're holding sort of event days so that if there's information being passed to local businesses about tendering, whether we're on social media, and if there's any statistics about the local business uptake at the moment. And I think that's kind of missing in this brief we've got.
Councillor Lewis.
In that regard, I wonder whether we can do a simplified tendering process for small businesses on smaller contracts, whether it has to be the same full shooting match for that. The other thing I was wondering when you were mentioning about maintenance and refurbishment is whether we are trapping all the information we possibly can from the repairs hotline, and when there are service requests, are we actually logging that and actually analysing the repairs that are necessary and where they're coming from, and trapping the data so that we can actually learn about scheduling.
I think it would certainly help, or my impression is it would help our procurement team if they had that sort of information. And I do wonder whether or not there's some sort of parallel lines going on where there's no crossover. In other words, you do one thing, so you have a reporting system for defects or whatever, but that doesn't get to be seen by the procurement side, because it would be useful for them to know about that. It may not be that something needs to be replaced as opposed to repaired, which is a less expensive operation potentially. But equally, and on a similar theme, talking to local businesses recently, and understanding, that very often it is a question of, I can't really write one of my few employees out for God knows how long it needs to fill in procurement forms, which are very complex. But I did wonder whether there was any scope for two things. One, a kind of resident satisfaction with local businesses collection of information, which could then be used by the procurement side. Because one of the challenges is, how do we know how good the local small businesses are? Well, very often it'll be residents who use them. So if we know what they're, because we know ourselves, if one of our friends has got a builder in or had some work done and it's very good, we tell each other. So why don't we see if residents can tell us, and we can then use that information and maybe feed that into the process. Councillor Smallwood.
Thank you, Chair. I wondered whether, I probably won't be here next time to question Matthew, but I wondered if work could be looked at about how we do procurement with other councils. I think there's an awful lot of work, let's take, if we were to buy bins, I find it desperately strange that each council's buying its own bins when potentially a group of councils could group together and get a better deal on buying bins, as an example. So it would be interesting if Matthew had been in one of the questions I'd have had for him, was what work is being done with neighbouring councils to potentially, when we are looking at procurement in the round. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Lewis.
Are you aware of what frameworks are? Because that's exactly what we get into a consortium with other authorities, and not only do we negotiate the quality and the quantities, and we get economies of scale by ordering together. So, for instance, our books, we buy those in exactly that way. So.
I mean, there are. Oh, sorry, Stuart. Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. Lots of the sentiment about local businesses and simplification, completely agree. Bearing in mind, I suppose procurement is also for our third sector, to balance that in as well. I'm interested how we can add value, or how officers look at not just the contract with the company that's directly delivering, but also the supply chain. So not necessarily subcontracting, but are they buying local for some of their materials? I mean, that's not always easy in Hillingdon, but it's for me, it's what other value is being added to the local economy in the way they operate, and particularly for the larger companies, although we'd love to have small local businesses have more opportunity as well. Maybe it is through them being engaged with larger people that can get the contracts. And I'm quite interested in like consortium with local businesses and a lead provider. And I know that gets more complicated. That's a very different way of just subcontracting when you can't deliver something. And I think there's a different mindset there. So it'd be useful to see how procurement are doing that. And in the pre-tender phase, how there is engagement. There are ways in which there's plans here, which we want to find more about. But I suppose what is the council or procurement doing to look at the local economy or the local market and going, well, we know we've got these things coming up. How do we build a competitive local market? How do we help small business become commission ready or procurement ready? There are some hints of it. I'd love to get a bigger picture of that vision, because if we know, for example, we're going towards carbon zero, there will be other innovations coming up. So how are we helping the local innovators and entrepreneurs to become ready to potentially bid for some of the things in the future that may come about? Because I think innovation is something that procurement can fuel, but sometimes can also stagnate because of the repetitive nature of most of our contracts, which has to be the way. But where there is chance to innovate, what can we do more to build with our business development side and procurement team a more, I want to say fertile environment, but there may be a better phrase.
Thank you. Councillor Lewis.
In the same vein, I mean, I do think that we... Sorry, did I jump in? I do think we should be moving towards becoming a social enterprise, to be honest. That we should be looking at how our suppliers employ their people, that they're all on minimum wages or London living wages. We must be looking, I'm sure we are looking at conflict mineral policies and anti-slavery and anti-child. But I think we should be looking at how our suppliers are looking after their staff. So do they have life insurance? Do they have pensions and all the good stuff that we take for granted? But I do think we should be moving towards becoming a purchaser who cares about the supply chain.
Councillor Munt.
Thank you, Chair. I echo Councillor Lewis in what he said previously as well in terms of simplifying the process for local businesses, and what he's just said now in terms of looking after the employees. I'm looking at page 9 at the top, and right at the top it seems like, unless I'm mistaken, that the council is yet to agree a definition for a local business, because there's a series of question marks on there, and at the end of the first sentence it says, but agreeing the definition is central to our approach. So it would be good to just take a step back and ask the officers what is their definition of a local business. Secondly, on the third bullet point down, when we're talking about identifying and seeking out local suppliers and having this one bid local policy, it would be interesting to see some facts and figures in terms of how many local businesses have bid in terms of this one bid local policy and how many have been successful historically, and what are we trying to get from this review in terms of going forward. It's difficult to put a marker on it in terms of the success criteria, but are we going to be happy if local businesses bid, or are we looking at a success criteria in terms of not just bidding but the contract award for a local business?
I know that there's, having spoken to Matthew before and others, that there has been a long-term, and other local authorities as well, a long-term aim, and there's always a long-term aim, because there's a kind of elliptical synergy about employing local people, employing local businesses, which means people don't have to travel so far, that they can work locally and all that sort of thing. But very often, what's being found is that it's the chicken and egg thing, or it's the, you can only do something once you've done it. So that once once a company is used to tendering to a local authority, which is quite different to quite a lot of other organisations that need that run procurement, and so what happens is that people become procurement fatigue, because it's too complicated. So we've suggested, and this has been suggested before, it's simplified, but the trouble is that the legislation, and certainly the new legislation, doesn't encourage simplification and ever more criteria. So I was wondering whether or not there was any scope for if we try and simplify the process for our officers as well, that the larger companies, if there's any way we can write into those contracts the need for them to look at a certain percentage of their work be done by local business. So that what you do is give local businesses a sort of piggyback into the process. But you look like that won't work, Councillor Lewis.
I think you'll end up being too prescriptive about how they perform the contracts, and tonight's session was supposedly to be value for money through the procurement process, which I can see we can talk about environmental benefits and social benefits and benefits to the local community, but I think you can't actually be too prescriptive, because what happens if the tender is won by a company that's outside the area? Do they then have to buy in those services, and what happens if those services are not available within the borough? But I would pick up on your point about defining the. I don't think it matters terribly much whether it's a small business, large business, or medium-sized business, or a micro business, or whether it's registered in the area. It's just a registered company office. Whether all the majority of their staff come, I just think it's moving towards what we should be trying to achieve, which is boosting the local economy. So I wonder, you can define things too tightly, and you end up actually precluding a lot of people that would benefit who are locals.
Councillor Smallwood.
Thank you, Chair. I think I echo what Councillor Lewis said. I think you could look at a system where, if a contract was tendered for a certain amount of money, the person who has taken that contract had to show that they had attempted to find local businesses in an appropriate way to help them deliver that contract. But I think if you became prescriptive and said it had to be, if there wasn't a local business in Hillingdon that delivered that, you would end up you could end up yourself having taken yourself down a garden path that you couldn't get back from. Just on Councillor Mann's point, I do agree. I think it needs to be broken down what is meant by local business, right? Because Heathrow against the person who is a scaffolder in Ruislip are two completely different things, but they're two local businesses. And I think that needs to just be broken down a little bit as to what they are, because I think when folk on the street think about local businesses, they think about, the person that's, putting their extension on their house, or the person that's running the florist in the high street. They're not thinking about Coca-Cola, who we know are based just down the road there. They're not thinking about Heathrow Airport, They're not thinking about the NHS, who employ thousands of people in the borough. So I do think that needs breaking down, possibly defining a little bit more. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Matt.
Thanks. Yeah, I think some interesting points raised. I think that I think it's important to define local business, but there are also challenges with that, because in the modern world, of course, a lot of people are remote working, especially in delivering sort of professional services. You could have a Hillingdon-based business, but people working remotely from all parts of the country or the world, and certainly that's one of the things to consider. I think one of the challenges that we have is that larger businesses sometimes have the benefit of getting bid writers to write their tenders, and I know there's a lot of external businesses out there from my own professional career that does happen a lot, and that puts a lot of disadvantage to local businesses that don't have that benefit. So I don't know if it's something that we could do to kind of mitigate that, by perhaps offering a similar service in-house in the council, to even if it's training or whatever, to help with that sort of tendering process.
Okay, I think your idea of inviting representatives of the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, of course, there's a Hillingdon-wide Chamber of Commerce, and then there's individual chambers of commerce in the different towns throughout Hillingdon. And I think that maybe getting along representatives from them to tell us what the challenges are, and tell us what the difficulties are. Because if it's right, as I'm told frequently, that we do try very hard to include local business, but it just doesn't happen, or it's difficult. It'd be useful to know from the community what the difficulties are, what would make life easier for them. And the other thing is, again, that I hear that there's, I wouldn't say a reluctance, but there's a lack of getting involved by local businesses in procurement for local authorities, because it is so very specialised and because it is quite complicated. And so in those circumstances, people back off and just get on with whatever they're doing. Councillor Lewis.
I wonder whether you might also wish to get local companies that have tendered, those that have been successful and those that have been unsuccessful, and ask them for their opinions about the tendering process. But I think they're all basically going to come down and say it's too complicated and too long, and actually puts the price up because it is such a complicated process. Yeah. And there's a risk factor within it, so they put the prices up.
Councillor Waithers.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the basic percentages, I'm intrigued as just generally why social values 10% pricing and quality have similar caps, and what the practice is elsewhere, and how, I mean, talking about some of the advances or the progress that Councillor Lewis was talking about in terms of ensuring that in good conscience we can continue to contribute to the local economy and local people through our procurement by the standards that we ask of those who win the tenders. Just how other councils who are maybe further down that journey or in a similar place have balanced their scoring matrix and the practical bits. My other point was that we've passed a few things in councils, the Modern Day Slavery Charter, the Carbon Zero, which with the more recent updates for climate change added the supply chain becoming carbon zero where practical by 2035. And I suppose it would be useful to know how the procurement team are responding to and reacting to those things that we as councillors feel are essential. So it would be useful to find out how quickly they can move as a ship, as it were. I know legislation can change things quite bluntly, quite quickly, but actually in terms of really building in the spirit of what is coming out of the chamber or out of select committees, just how complicated it is to move the ship.
I wonder sometimes whether the conversion of aspiration, as you've just described, into the kind of business reality, and what we don't want, do we, are to have these desirable outcomes blocking procurement progress, and having the elements of the desirability underpinning what we do, as potentially, as opposed to potentially being blockers. So if we set a series of aspirations, but in fact, in order to achieve those, procurement officers are tied up trying to meet them in a way that stops them from then progressing to local businesses or whichever businesses that we're aiming for. I suppose really the rhetorical question I'm asking is how do we manage the difference between quite proper expectation and converting that into business reality? Now, it may be that some businesses are doing it already, so what we're asking for doesn't need to be built in. So what needs to be done is there to be a review of the businesses that we're looking at to see what it is they're doing already, which may well match the aspirations that we set running. So I think a kind of balance there, trying to work out how we achieve what we would like to have happen, set against the business reality, might be something that we raise with officers. I think that's possibly an interesting area, because I do wonder sometimes when a lot of these issues, some of them are fundamental and need to be there anyway. That's obvious. But some of the others, I just wonder whether or not that sometimes companies will be doing it anyway, because maybe it's part and parcel of what they do. But the difference between what we want and what they're doing, how do we manage that? How do we get that to be successful? All right. Well, look, those are very good ideas and some useful thoughts. We've obviously all considered this very carefully, and I always thought this was a very good topic to run with, procurement generally. I'm going to make a bold decision here and suggest that I don't think Matthew's able to make it for some reason that we don't know about. So I think that we have a lot of good ideas which you've been jotting down. Thank you very much. So I think what we'll do is, unless anybody's got any additional matters to raise or to pitch in, and I've always said this, if there's anything that you think about outside the meeting that hasn't been said, then send me an email or send Councillor Matthews an email, and we'll have a look at it and put it into the pot for next time. It's not just exclusively what we discuss here. I mean, I'm sure that we look at these sorts of things outside of this meeting anyway. A lot of this documentation that we've been given as examples is actually quite interesting, and shows, doesn't it, that a lot of the questions are really very complicated and quite time consuming. Even just reading them takes quite a long time, and appreciating what they're all about. So that gives us a taste. Sorry?
Especially the speed on
Yes. All right. Okay. So is everyone happy that we've sort of thought about this? And okay, we can move on. The next item is item 6, which is the Cabinet Forward Plan, which is really for noting, and we will have thought about that in different fora. You'll see that, as I say, at item 6, and it's really just to note. I mean, we're getting into the season now of the council budget preparation and presentation later in the early part of the next year, and we can see there that budget requirements and the MTFF are coming up in the next couple of months. So that once we've and we'll obviously have another session, and we'll have to have another. Since Matthew hasn't been able to make it, do we try and fix an additional date to deal with what we would have dealt with tonight, or do we just roll over to the next meeting? My inclination is that we put in an extra date so that we can deal with it properly and then get back on track.
Especially with the budget.
Do we agree? Yeah. Okay. I don't really want this to have to roll into budget time, because we're going to need a lot of time for that. So if I can ask that we maybe spin an email around, everybody pings in some dates to avoid, and then we try and reset this maybe sometime in December before all the festivities kick off. All right. So everybody happy with the forward plan? Any questions?
Yeah, I do think it's not just for noting. It's to say whether there are any topics that we want to discuss further.
Yes. It is, but because we are coming into the sort of budget consideration time. Do you want to press your button?
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's going to be quite challenging, but I think that having picked procurement as an initial subject matter, then yes, I mean there may very well be topics within the forward plan that we do want to highlight, but we need to deal with the budget first.
But there is a framework agreement on page 46. 46 going to Cabinet on the 23rd of March.
Oh, right, okay.
Might just be worth having a look at, only in as much as frameworks are key, critical to this.
Yeah.
When do we complete this report?
Which one?
The one we're working on.
Oh, the procurement one.
Procurement.
Well, we've got this session just to repeat. Then we've got the final session on post-tender. So that would have taken us to the December meeting if we'd have had this one.
So there really isn't time to actually look at that that framework.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Can you scroll?
What I suggest we do.
Chair, just on a point of order, apologies. Your microphone isn't on, so I'm assuming it won't be on the live
Quite
stream.
right.
My apologies to interrupt you.
No. You're quite right to interrupt. I should have put my microphone on. What I suggest we do is take this away and you can and go through the forward plan and any other areas that you'd like us to look at. Then drop me an email and we'll include those on our future work programme, which is a nice little segue to item 7, which is the work programme. All right, so we've got next meeting dates are 11th of January, 8th of February, 1st of March, 19th of April. But as I say, that the anything in addition to the idea was to keep the work programme relatively light at this time of year, so that we can deal with the undoubtedly very paper-heavy or information-heavy budget time. But as we see on the fold-out work programme, 22-23, we've got all the various sessions fitting in there, and it does seem to me that once we've got the other side of the sort of finance considerations, then we can look at other interesting topics. And I'm thinking that probably this report, Councillor Lewis, is likely to be written and ready to go to Cabinet probably sort of January time, do you think? That sort of thing? Yes, we'd have thought January time.
Thank you, Chairman. So according to the work programme, we have another witness session in January.
Yep.
And we'll aim to get the report to Cabinet in April time.
Oh, April, okay. All right. So, anything else anybody would like to bring up? Okay. Well, if there's nothing else that anybody else wants to raise, no doubt we'll find out what happened to Matthew, but useful discussion, and therefore I will close the meeting. Thank you very much.